Welcome back to Figuring It Out with Rachel Lee. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to remind you to make sure you're following the show so you'll get notified whenever new content is released. Also, if something in today's discussion resonates with you or might be valuable to someone you know, please feel free to share it with them. My goal is to reach and help anyone who might benefit from these conversations. Thank you for being part of this community. So without further ado, let's get into today's topic. Today, I want to talk about healing, but not the version of healing we usually hear about, not the dramatic breakthrough, not the moment where everything suddenly makes sense, not the glow up and the before and after version that you might see on Hallmark or any other made-for-TV movie. I want to talk about what healing actually looks like in real life. Quiet, internal, and often inconvenient. And usually it'll go unnoticed while it's happening because most of the time you don't realize you're healing until you look back and you notice you show up differently than you used to. We've been taught to expect healing to feel like some clarity, like this big relief, like an arrival to a destination that we've been holding out for. But real healing rarely announces itself that way. Most of the time it feels uncomfortable. It's slower than you want. It feels like questioning things you used to accept as normal. And healing doesn't feel like progress while you're in it. It feels like disruption because your nervous system is unlearning patterns that once helped you. So if you ever thought, why does this feel harder instead of easier? That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It often means it's working. And for me, healing didn't show up as one big moment. It shows up in small shifts. I pause before reacting. I stop explaining myself as much. I notice when my body gets tight or overwhelmed. And I didn't feel fixed. I still don't feel fixed, right? I just feel more present in my day-to-day. And part of healing is being able to look honestly at the things you once brushed off as no big deal, things that didn't maybe seem harmful on the surface, but they no longer fit into who you are becoming. And that's where this next part is going to come in, right? So pay attention. One of the bigger parts of my healing for me has been becoming a non-drinker. And let me say, maybe not forever, but just for this season of my life, I am a non-drinker. And I want to be clear about something because nuance matters, right? When I drank, it wasn't always about an escape. A lot of times it was just social. A barbecue, a happy hour, hanging out, time with friends. Nothing dramatic. But because of where I was internally at the time, what would start as something casual could quickly turn into me drinking too much. And when that happened, I wasn't showing up as the version of myself that I respected. I would become more emotional, more reactive, more likely to look outside of myself for validation because I didn't know how to give it to myself yet. Let me be clear on that. And it wasn't because I didn't have values. Not because I didn't care, but because alcohol made it easier to disconnect from myself and ignore my own boundaries. And over time, I've had to look at that honestly, not with shame, but with responsibility. And don't get me wrong, there were moments I'm not proud of, and there have been times where my boys have seen me drunk. And back then, it felt harmless. But looking back now, I'm embarrassed by that version of myself. And I'm grateful that my boys now have a mom who shows up fully present. And here's the part that really surprised me the most. I used to think I needed alcohol to be fun, relaxed, outgoing, to access that carefree version of myself. Plot twist, I'm still funny as fuck sober. I still laugh. I still have energy. I still enjoy people. I'm still me, actually. And I didn't lose anything by not drinking. If anything, I found myself, and I'm still amazing. So this wasn't about never having a drink again. It was about realizing I don't need it. Not to cope, not to connect, not to feel like myself. And that, for me, is an example of what healing can look like. Choosing presence over numbing, alignment over momentary escape, and deciding that abandoning myself, even quietly, was no longer acceptable. Now let's take a look at what healing isn't, okay? Healing isn't cutting everyone off and calling it boundaries. At least for me, healing hasn't looked like isolating myself from every person, place, or relationship I've ever known. It also doesn't look like realizing a relationship isn't right at this time in my life and then starting an argument, creating drama, or blowing everything up just to force distance. Healing isn't making impulsive decisions and calling them empowerment. It isn't ghosting people instead of getting clear with yourself. It isn't burning bridges to prove you're, quote unquote, choosing yourself. It isn't reacting from pain and calling it self-respect. Healing doesn't require destruction. It also isn't forcing closure conversations when you're not emotionally regulated enough to have them. Healing isn't changing everything all at once. It isn't reinventing yourself overnight. It isn't proving anything to anyone. And for me, healing has become more about having less reaction, not more of a reaction. More steadiness, more awareness, more intention in my life. Because anything that overwhelms your nervous system, it isn't healing. It's just another form of self-abandonment with better branding. I want to pause here and offer something practical because I know people will often ask, okay, but where do I even start? And healing doesn't start with necessarily fixing yourself or something specific, right? The first thing is it starts with noticing yourself. Sometimes healing looks like taking a deep breath and realizing how tense your body has been all day. And sometimes it looks like paying attention to what's draining you and what gives you some relief. Sometimes it's doing nothing at all. And I once heard someone say, and I really wish I could remember where I heard it, but they said, when you do not know what to do nothing. And that will create space, right? Because you're not doing nothing from avoidance, but from choice. And when you create space, you give yourself power. Healing can also look like pausing before responding, sitting with a feeling instead of numbing it, choosing rest without explaining why, asking yourself, is this thought helping me or hurting me? And a lot of healing is your mindset. It's recognizing that you can't change the past. It's done. But you do get to decide where you're going to go next. And sometimes healing might just look like gratitude for where you are right now, even if it's not where you want to stay. Not because you're settling, but because gratitude regulates your nervous system. And it will create clarity instead of urgency. But keep in mind, healing is going to look different for everyone. But when you start paying attention to your body, your thoughts, your reactions, those have a way of showing you where to begin. So, how do you know if you're actually healing? Here's a few things that'll let you know if you're healing. You feel instead of being numb. You don't chase validation the same way. You leave situations sooner. You stop over-explaining yourself. You listen to your body. Trust your own timing. You choose alignment over urgency. And make note that most of these changes are invisible to other people, but you'll notice, and they can change everything. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you again that healing isn't going to look the same for everyone, and it doesn't need to. What matters is that you're showing up differently than you used to, even if nothing looks dramatically different yet. If this episode resonated and you're in a season of learning how to support yourself instead of abandoning yourself, that's the work I do with my clients. My DMs are open if you ever want to talk about what that could look like for you, or you just need some support. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.